Hello ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a look at how to calculate wages for different jobs. Now we're mainly focused on hourly pay and different types of hourly pay. Along with hourly, you can also get tips, commission, overtime, and hourly pay just means that you could get paid a certain amount of money per hour that you work. All right, so the most common pay structure that high school students encounter is that of an hourly wage. And here's an example from my own personal history. In 1998, I started working as a teacher assistant for the summer camp programs at the College of DuPage. Right, so at the time, I was earning about $7.65 per hour, and I worked anywhere from 20 hours to about 38 hours per week. Right, now, how can I write an equation to represent my gross weekly paycheck? Now, gross just means my paycheck before taxes are taken out. All right, that's what the term gross means. Before I can write an equation, I do need to make sure that I'm defining my variables. All right, so I'm going to use W to represent my gross weekly paycheck. And I'm going to use H to represent number of hours worked. Now I'm going to use these same variables throughout the entire rest of this activity, so I'm only going to define these once, but they have been defined. So when I go to write my equation, I can write it as my gross weekly paycheck is going to equal the amount of money I make for each hour that I worked times the number of hours that I worked, so I'm just going to take 7.65 times H. Now remember, whenever you don't put a symbol between the variable and the number, you are automatically assuming that's multiplication. You could put parentheses around the H if you wanted. You don't have to though. Right? Now, let's use the equation to calculate my gross weekly pay for a slow week and then also for a busy week. So for a slow week, my gross weekly pay would equal my $7.65 per hour times the 20 hours that I would have worked. Right, now that would have come out to a total of $153 for that paycheck. Now that's, again, before taxes are taken out. So the paycheck I would have seen actually being deposited in my account, smaller. All right, now a busy week, that was more my 38-hour weeks, and I had far more busy weeks than I had slow weeks. So my gross weekly pay would have still equaled 7.65, but times the 38 now. I know 38 seems like an odd number, but actually it's an even number, but a strange number to have for the number of hours that I would work in that week for a busy week, but they always tried to keep me below 40 hours because they weren't authorized to pay me benefits. And if I had worked a full 40 hours, they would have had to pay me benefits in addition to this. All right, so that's why the kind of strange number there. All right, so if I multiply these out, I would have gotten $290.70. All right, so hourly pay without any other tips, commissions, overtime, just a straight up how much you get paid per hour times number of hours that you worked kind of calculation. So your equation reflects that, and then your calculations reflect that. All right, let's move on to the next type of pay. All right, so hourly wage plus tips is another common pay structure that high school students who are working as wait staff tend to experience. So let's take a look at an example for this. So for example, a student working at an Illinois restaurant might make about $6.60 per hour plus tips. Now the $6.60 per hour is actually the minimum wage for wait staff positions if you are earning tips. All right, that's current Illinois law, at least current as of the time of this video. All right, the average amount earned in tips per shift is about $45. When I looked it up, it said between like $40 to $50, so I just decided to split it down the middle and make it $45. Now, if you typically earn about $250 in tips, how can we write an equation to represent your weekly pay? All right, so I'm still going to use W for my gross weekly pay is equal to the $6.60 that I make per hour plus the tips on top of that, so $250 for a typical week, so kind of average amount of tips. All right, this would now be my equation. So I have the hourly calculation I was doing before plus the flat amount that I would have earned in tips for a typical week. Now, if I want to use this equation, I have to be careful because the way that people tend to talk about waitstaff positions, they tend to talk in terms of how many shifts they have in a week. Now, the number of hours that they work during those shifts can vary a little bit depending on whether or not the place that they're working in is kind of having a slow day or a busy day. Sometimes they get sent home early, sometimes they work their full shift. Now, if you work 5 6-hour shifts, you have to take the 5 shifts times the 6 hours for each one of them to calculate the 30 hours before you use any of these numbers in the equation. So you have to think through, how many hours did I actually work? I worked 5 6-hour shifts. I can't just put 5 or 6 straight in here. I have to calculate what H is first. And then I can go ahead and use that 30 hours in place of H in this equation. So $6.60 times the 30 hours that I worked, plus the $250 for a typical week. And when I put all that together, it combines to equal about $448 even. All right, now, because things don't always turn out to be a typical week, let's take a look at any adjustments that we might have to make. All right, so if you work 5 4.5-hour shifts instead, let's say they're having a slow week, and you only earn about $150 in tips because it's a slow week, how much would you make? And how would this change our equation? So let's look at how this would change our equation first. All right, so the $250 that we were previously using for tips has changed now to $150. And that means that our equation is no longer 660 times H plus 250. It's now 660 times H plus 150. And then we can go ahead and figure out how many hours total we worked, use that in our equation, and work through this. Now for our hours, we have to take the 5 shifts that we worked times the 4.5 hours for each of those shifts. And that comes out to about 22.5 hours. So back to my equation. My weekly wage is equal to $6.60 times 22.5, and then plus the 150 for the tips. Right, now, when you calculate that all together, that ends up being about $298.50. All right, so that's how you go through and you do a calculation with tips. Okay, let's take a look at that next page. We have 2 more types of pay that we want to take a look at. All right, so let's look at hourly pay plus commission now. Now, hourly pay plus commission is common in sales positions where a company wants to motivate the employee to sell as much merchandise as possible. All right, so for example, a salesperson makes an hourly rate of $10 per hour plus 3% commission based on their total weekly sales. So let's see what we can do with this. How would we calculate their gross weekly paycheck without commission? Now, without commission, gross weekly pay would equal just the $10 per hour times the number of hours that they're working. All right, if they don't sell anything, all they get is their hourly pay. Now, if sales associates at the store average $4,500 in sales per week, how will the equation represent their gross weekly paycheck, or how will the equation to represent their gross weekly paycheck change when the average weekly commission is included? All right, so on top of the hourly pay, we would need to add on the weekly commission. So the average weekly commission would be the 3% that we had up here. All right, so to turn that into a multiplier, I need to take 3 divided by 100. Percent means out of 100. The percent sign is made up of a division sign and the 2 zeros from the 100 to represent the 2 place values that were changed. So if you divide that 100 back into the percent value, that changes the number to 0.03 so that you have the full mathematical value of the number represented. All right, so 0.03 times the 4,500 turns out to be about $135. Now, this $135 represents the portion of the sales that the employee gets to take home because they made the sale to begin with. So any sales an employee makes that are attributed to their sales ID would basically go into the calculation for their commission, right? It's a way to motivate their employees to actually, sell things, not just stand around and talk. But sometimes it can create a very pushy sales environment, so companies have to be kind of careful with this structure. All right, so now let's go ahead and use this with this equation. So our gross weekly pay would have been the $10 per hour plus the commission. All right, so how does the equation to represent their gross weekly pay change? We had to add on the amount of money for the commission in addition to the hourly pay. Now, what would their gross weekly paycheck be for a 25-hour week without commission? So they didn't sell anything, but they worked 25 hours. We want to go back up to this original equation and take our gross weekly pay is going to equal $10 per hour times the 25 hours that they worked, which gives us $250 for that paycheck. And again, this is before taxes. Now, what would their gross weekly paycheck be for a 35-hour week with an average commission? So now I want to go to this equation. So still $10 per hour, now working 35 hours, plus I get that $135 for the average commission. And that turns out to be about $485. All right, so a big difference between working just a slow week without commission, without selling anything, and then working a 35-hour week and actually making an average sales amount. Right, and then finally, the last type of pay that we're looking at and that you may experience is hourly pay plus overtime. All right, overtime is calculated as time and a half, so 1.5 times the hourly rate when an employee works more than 40 hours. So this overtime pay rate is only applicable to hours beyond the first 40 that an employee works. All right, so for example, a construction worker is paid about $16 per hour with the possibility of up to 8 hours of overtime. All right, how could we write an equation to represent the gross weekly pay for a typical week without overtime? So the gross weekly pay would equal the hourly pay of $16 per hour times the number of hours that they worked. So the hourly pay equation has pretty much been the same throughout all of these examples. It's how much you make per hour times the number of hours. Now, how would this equation change to represent the gross weekly pay with overtime? So let's take a look at this. If we know that we're getting overtime, we've definitely worked the 40 hours. So I would take my original equation, but take the 16 times 40 because I know I've already worked the 40 hours. So I got paid $16 per hour for the first 40. Now for the overtime, I have to add on time and a half. So I'm going to take the $16 per hour times 1.5 to calculate my time and a half rate. And for overtime, I would get paid, miswrote there, $24 per hour. All right, so $24 per hour times the number of hours beyond 40 that I've worked. So if I look at my total number of hours, I would have to deduct the 40 that I already worked from that total. So if I worked 41 hours, 41 minus 40 gives me just 1 hour at that $24 pay rate. If I worked 43 hours that week, then 43 minus 40 calculates the 3 hours of overtime times the 24 would get me my overtime pay plus the original pay. So let's simplify this down just a little bit. 16 times 40 would give me $640 for the regular pay, plus $24 per every hour over 40. Right, and that's how you calculate with overtime. Right, I will see you in class.